last lunch seminar of the year, which is about critical environmental politics. Here we have Luigi Pellizzoni, Viviana, Asara, and Emanuele Lombardi. And we will also have not only three speakers, but this time also three discussants. So I want to thank in advance Irina, Gemma, who is online, and Eugene. I will briefly introduce the speakers. Luigi Pellizzoni doesn't need introduction. He's already with us since about 1 year now. He's a professor of environmental sociology at the Scuola. Viviana Asara is assistant professor in sociology at the Department of Humanities at the Università of Ferrara and research affiliate at the University of Vienna. And Emanuele Lombardi is assistant professor at the University of Bologna, where he teaches ecology and labor in the Anthropocene. So I will leave you immediately the floor to you. As you know, the format is about 1 hour and a half in total, so more or less for the speaker or speakers, there is 45 minutes maximum for presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and apologies for this delay due to overlapping commitments, so to say, but I hope that we will be able to compensate for this delay with an interesting discussion or presentation. So I'm really pleased to have the possibility to present and to discuss with you this work that took quite a lot of time to produce, because basically it was about 3 years from early conception to final publication, so it was a big effort. And so we decided to divide our presentation in some pieces, starting with the notion of the framework of the idea of critical environmental politics, and then having a look at the structure of the handbook, and then some focus on some core topics like the climate crisis that was part of a central issue in the conception of the handbook in different parts. And then, if there is time, some focus on some specific issue. So I go very quickly about the conception of critical environmental politics. So our first question when conceiving also the structure and the topics was about what does it mean to be critical in addressing environmental politics. And so we started from the idea that being critical means trying to not to address the problem of the environment, the problem of environmental politics, taking for granted what it is the problem of the environment, what it is politics, but trying to discuss the fundamentals or the grounds of the problematic. So the typical way to frame this is to take this quite well-known Cox article about a problem-solving outlook versus critical outlook. So problem-solving outlook is taking for granted the organization of society, what are in our case, the environmental issues, the environmental problems, what are the institutions for addressing this problem, and so on and so forth. Instead, taking a critical outlook means asking why the problem is such, what is the environment, what are we talking about, what are the institutional arrangements that why they are set in a certain way, why valuable knowledge is this and that, what are the authorities that are dealing with the problems, and so on and so forth. And of course, within evoking the notion of critique, of being critical, the obvious reference is to the critical theory tradition, which is present in the handbook, but also in many chapters this critical theory tradition is problematized because it has to do with the Western reason tradition. So this is a matter of contention, the extent to which we can appeal to the critical theory tradition in the sense that it still subscribes to the notion of reason with big R, capital letter R, whereas there is, particularly in our field, a strong critique of this tradition of Western reason, especially considering the feminist and decolonial strands of thinking that raise a big criticism about this tradition. And also considering that there is those trends that give relevance to non-human agents of the relationship between humans and non-humans, that as well are very critical of the tradition of science, the tradition of scientific research and modern technology. So there is a lot of things running there, but we believe that it is still possible with this kind of attention to take the word critical in an emancipatory way. So recovering the emancipatory thrust of the critical tradition while also taking in consideration all those trends that criticize the Western critical tradition. And there are many chapters, as we will show in the structure of the book and the chapters, that show this perspective. Of course, capitalism comes up time and again as a typical expression of a certain way to understand Western rationality, Western reason. Environment also is problematic because environment is not the same as nature. Nature is a very complex concept that is addressed in many ways in the book. But environment is a relational concept that has to do with the way in which human society interact with their biophysical underpinnings. And so it has to do with those knowledges and forms of knowledge and power came up during especially modernity and in relation with a certain political organization, particularly the modern state. So all the competencies that and savoirs to use this knowledge. But also environment evokes environmentalism, so the environmental mobilizations that emerge in response to the rise of the ecological crisis. So also the notion of crisis is quite present, the ecological crisis is quite present in the different chapters. And also, again, in a problematic way, in the sense that the environmental movement, as it came up in response to the ecological crisis, but within Western countries, within Western society, has been in the turn criticized from the viewpoint of the oppressed or the peripheral areas of the extractivist areas of the world. So the problem of the colonial and again the feminist perspective as typical ways of looking in a critical way to the ecological mobilization, especially in those declinations that accept, let's say, for example, scientific environmentalism, so subscribe to the kind of idea that is possible to solve the problems by just correcting the trajectory of science and so on and so forth. And also, of course, all the different variants. We'll be talking a little bit of that, of green capitalism, so greening of technology. And of course, this has a lot to do with the way in which we understand the relationship with materiality and the relationship also with work and labor. If we have time, we will be addressing this. And also, last thing that I say is that the ecological movement has been quite often associated with the post-materialist values. So it has been famously associated as a typical expression of post-materialism. So something good for affluent countries, but not so good for emerging countries and peripheral countries. And this has been challenged recently by so-called prefigurative mobilizations, which very often are focusing on a new sort of relationship with materiality. So this is also a point that has been addressed in the book.
Thank you, Luigi. Okay. So the notion of environment, so connecting to what Luigi was just saying, the notion of environment also entails how the environment is actually used, constructed in political struggles and action. So it involves basically the idea that values are not something, an intrinsic quality of things, but are a result of valuation and evaluation processes. And this is connected also to the topic of power struggles, no? So political struggles, power struggle related to whose values are going to dominate, no? And the idea also of so-called alternative value practices that can emerge, for example, out of mobilization, no? And so out of political and collective action in general. With regard to the term politics, we have espoused a post-foundational posture. That means that is politics is where there is a constant interrogation of the metaphysical grounds of foundation. So politics is not simply the ontic manifestation of conventional politics, such as a political institution, the political system, but it encompasses the political, that is that involves also political antagonism. The political is the ontological dimension of the institution of society, no? And this means that with regards to environmental politics, critical environmental politics should entail a critique of those instituted forms of conventional politics that contribute to mark the current socio-ecological crisis. And so the critique of also the continuous displacement of the real socio-ecological processes or denial of the real socio-ecological processes that actually drive the socio-ecological crisis. So, for example, some of these could be the capitalist mode of production and consumption, and its generalization through the so-called imperial mode of living, what some authors such as Ulrich Brand and Markus Wissen have termed the imperial mode of living, which is deeply rooted in everyday practices. And it involves also this critical posture about politics, environmental politics, also, let's say, a critique of the so-called politics of unsustainability. So the idea that the ecological transition has actually turned into a new orthodoxy. So the environmental issues has been turned well, this is not now, so this is something that has occurred throughout the years, of course, but it has increasingly turned into a techno-managerial issue. Let's say revolving around issues such as green finance, market-based instrument, circular economy, and we have seen with the European Union green taxonomy now even nuclear gas and fossil gas are even considered to be sustainable, no? That means a critique of the way, let's say, the ecological limits are turned into an opportunity for market-led valorization, as Luigi will also explain, and also Emanuele later, and also the link of all this with the slippage into post-democratic governance. So next slide, thanks. We have asked the authors to use in a flexible manner this common structure. Some have followed it more closely, others more flexibly, of course. So the idea to have a section on the genealogy of the concept of their chapter, and then the problem framing and the key issues, and then the contentious issues and standpoints. And finally, the open question and transformative potential. Thanks. And the handbook is organized into 6 sections. The first one is devoted to the 4 theoretical strands of major relevance for the field of environmental politics. So these are, I cannot read very well, but the critical theory, decolonial ecologies, feminism, and Marxism. I have it here as well, so that it's easier. Then the second section is on contested notions. So we have the Anthropocene, buen vivir, degrowth, limits, sustainability. So contentious issues in the sense that around which the academic debate has occurred, but where there are also different, let's say, views regarding those concepts. Then key issues that involves basically the challenges, the conflicts, the institutional arrangements, regulatory processes and approaches, and so on, such as agrarian development and food security, bioeconomy, cities and the environment, climate justice, the commons, the cultural political economy of research and innovation, disasters and catastrophes, energy politics and energy transition, expertise, lay local knowledge and environment, extractivism and neo-extractivism, religion and ecology, then social metabolism, technological fixes, and the values of nature. Then the 4th session is on governance, so the institutionalized arrangements of different sorts. For example, we have looked at the democracy, environmental violence, environment-related human mobility, financialization of nature, fossil fuel and state-industry relations, global environmental governance and the state, just transition, sustainable welfare. And then the next section, the 5th one, is takes a bottom-up approach, so it's on mobilization. So it includes climate change consensus as a depoliticized deadlock, so a critique of the climate change consensus by exactly one of these authors that has taken a post-foundational posture. Ecological mobilization in the global south, engaging the everyday and environmental movements, and more than social movements. And then finally, the 6th section is on new directions. So the new, or let's say the emergent issues and perspectives. Some of them have already been dealt with in other sections. For example, decolonizing environmental politics. So this focuses on the emergent issues within the field. Digitalization, ecofeminism, which has also been dealt with in the theoretical strands. Geopower, transformative innovation, and post-work and ecology that Luigi will explain later. Yes.
Precisely, but I will start and I will take maximum 15 minutes. So thank you so much for having us. And I will connect to the 2 previous presentations by saying that, wait a second. In any case, no big deal. Because after having, let's say, investigated what does critical mean in general terms, and then, more political terms, what we wanted to do in the introduction was basically to insert some reflections about conjunctural elements. From where do we speak? From which approach do we address some of the problems we collected in the handbook? And the idea was like, let's try to produce something which is, by situating itself openly, it can be useful also to read, what comes next, because we wrote the introduction basically in between the pre-COP in Milan, so September, October 2021, and the 26th COP in Glasgow. So that was, and in our opinion, we felt we were witnessing a sort of like a ruptural moment, both from the perspective of climate governance and from the perspective of climate justice movements. So basically, we tried to condense these two reflections. And from the governance perspective, the idea is what seemed to us to be coming to a close was the season, the age of mitigation in climate policy, which was foundational when it comes to climate policy, but not foundational at all when it comes to environmental international law. Because I mean, in the 70s and 80s, when international environmental politics policy emerged, the idea was that the relationship between capitalist development or economic growth and environmental protection was like, one of mutual opposition. Either you privilege one, but if you do so, you will do that at the expenses of the other, or vice versa. Okay? The idea that capitalist development could be predicated on fixing the ecological problem was yet to come. Okay? And in fact, international environmental policy is a sectoral policy. That issue, for example, the ozone layer, whose paradigm is the Montreal Protocol, which is precisely the opposite of what the Kyoto Protocol is. The Montreal Protocol says basically, okay, the scientific community is giving us evidence that there is an issue. Like, CFC, when emitted, produce an ozone, a hole in the ozone layer, and that's problematic. So what do? We ban CFCs. Right? Okay, some economic sectors will suffer from that. Like, a few value chains shut down completely, but then the economic system will adapt and will move on. So when climate issues emerged, not in terms of policy, but in terms of debate, the main political register in which they were organized was the one of adaptation. So basically, since CO2 equivalent is not CFCs, like, there is no way you can shut down the emission of CO2 equivalent without shutting down the whole economic structure of the whole world. So you cannot really solve the issue. You cannot reduce emissions. You have to adapt. And that was the same, as a political discourse in the USSR and in the US. What happened at the beginning, in terms of conceptions, late 80s, but in terms of policy, starting from the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, was the conception and then the implementation of something called the green economy, whose main tenet is, well, we have looked at the issue the wrong way. Actually, by internalizing ecological nuisances within capitalist circuits, you can have both capitalist development and the solution of environmental issues. When it comes to climate change, you can have both the reduction of CO2 equivalent emissions and economic performance. So the rate of profit can be up in any case. And the idea is, okay, global warming is a typical example of market failure. So it has been historically unable to internalize so-called negative externalities. But if we actually find a way to price these negative externalities and to create markets, especially dedicated markets, on which these new commodities can be exchanged, then we can have the self-regulating drive of the markets in place, and you can have the twofold promise: less emissions, more profit. Payment for ecosystem services, carbon markets, and the likes, biodiversity offsets are created along those lines. So the political economical pillars of this implementation rest on this green economy. So basically, right now, and I mean, the Kyoto Protocol as well as the Paris Agreement have in common this idea of solving, economically speaking, ecological issues created by previous economic thinking. So right now, after 25, 30 years of implementation, it becomes legitimate, we thought, to ask ourselves, have these models worked? I mean, the double promise was profits and emissions reduction. In terms of profit, the issue is very complicated because it comes to, like, is financial profit really valuable? Huge question. I will not go there. But there is consensus in the scientific literature that if value has been created, if money has been made, it is much less than it was supposed to be in the late 90s, beginning of the 2000s. So at least they may have been performing decently, but not well. That's for sure. The big issue, which is uncontestable, is though the ecological performance. And so that is the moment of the slide, because 1990 is an important year in climate policy because it's the baseline year of the Kyoto Protocol. It's nice, the story why that's the case. I don't have time, maybe in the Q&A. But in any case, the idea is humanity has emitted more CO2 equivalent from 1990 to 2021. So since we had a policy at play to tackle the issue, then it was the case from 1750, which is the conventional year the estimate starts from, and 1990. So the main idea is, we thought it was, and it seems to me that how the COP28 in Dubai is unfolding confirms this, that the common rhetoric, which used to be, COP system is doing well, but not fast enough. So the direction is correct, but we are moving too slowly towards that direction. And what this slide tells us, and this is, the rendition is in Greta Thunberg's edited book, The Climate Book, but the data is IPCC data. And actually, the COP system is running fast in a direction which is the opposite, and the one they claim they want to go towards. So if this era of mitigation, because if adaptation is we cannot reduce emissions, but we can adapt, the mitigation era, which has inspired the policies I have just described, was, no, we can have both, okay? And right now, I think we are past that. Like, having at the head of COP28 an oilman, because that's the case, seems to me, at the very least, because right now we are talking about COP28, to demonstrate quite straightforwardly that we are now back within an adaptation frame in which phase down may be discussed. Phase out of fossil fuels is out of question. And the point is, through economic growth, we can have more money to invest in adaptation, which means we will have more and more meteorological extreme events, but we will be better and better in dealing with them. Okay? And to do so, we need more money, which is economic growth, and of course, it will mean more CO2 equivalent emissions. And so we are no longer trying to solve the problem at the root, but we are back to the adaptation system. We as the COP system, like, humans which are represented there. This rupture, though, is mirrored, and I'm going to conclude, also within the framework of climate justice movements, because since the late 90s, let's say the Kyoto Protocol, social movements dealing with climate issues, and these movements belong, of course, to the alter globalization cycle of global rising, struggles, protests. And for them, from their perspective, the situation was quite complex because, of course, the Framework Convention on Climate Change led by the UN, on the one hand, would be a natural partner because it ostracized from the very beginning the public enemy number one of those movements, which means like climate denialists, saying like, no, we agree that the root cause of climate change is anthropic activity, so let's build up a political arena which is at the same time multilateral, as in the normal tradition of the UN, but also participatory. So civil society must be included from the very beginning. But we will go with market instruments. So the movements were okay when it comes to climate science and not okay when it comes to political solutions. And the idea was, let's assume a posture of critical proximity. So we go in to say it's okay, like, the framework is correct, but we need a mix of policies. We cannot just rest on the market. And of course, the idea was to push the COP system to run faster towards the supposed to be right direction. But then when the movements after the Paris Agreement started to talk about this, they realized that probably it wasn't enough what they had done before, and their perception of the climate issues started to change because thank you. Because up until 2015, 2018, the normal way from a climate justice perspective to look at the issue was a nation-state based one. Okay, so basically we had, if we looked at absolute emissions, then the villain is clearly China. If we looked at the per capita emission, then the villain is the US or the average US citizen. But the idea is there must be a villain and it must be a nation state. Complicated because right now in 2 minutes I cannot be precise, so I will be very assertive. When Greta Thunberg becomes a global public figure, what she does in political terms is to basically say, we have been critically proximate to you and we have provided political legitimacy to the whole system. We will stop doing that because this political legitimacy hasn't translated into effective policy. Okay? By doing so, by let's say, uprooting the participation of this kind of civil society, on the one hand, the climate governance system stopped to be particularly interested in involving civil society. Of course, COP28 is in the Arab United Emirates, and the previous one was in Egypt. So we know they can protest today only in the blue zone at COP28. But more importantly, I think the perception of the climate issue changed. Luigi. And so basically the point is, the question was not who's the villain, China or the US, but basically like, who's emitting the most in China as well as in the US. So basically they unpacked the data along revenue groups rather than in terms of nation states. And what they found was basically this. And I'm concluding here, if you want to just move, just to say that in the very last Oxfam report titled significantly Climate Equality, a Planet for the 99%, in 2020 it was Climate Inequality, how to stop climate billionaires. So like, there is a recognition of the role of social movements in changing the way societies perceive climate change as a political issue. But here, the main issue is if we unpack data in that way, and if we assume like the dotted line very close to zero is what, in a scenario of complete equality, everybody of us could emit, okay, in order to basically be in line with the optimistic scenario of the Paris Agreement, which is 1.5 increase of temperature in 2100 with regard to pre-industrial levels of global temperature. Then we see that the bottom 50% can double their emissions. So the old idea, the post-materialist idea that it is poverty that creates climate emissions is disproved by this data, clearly. The middle 40%, which unless very rich people or very poor people are here in this room, is more or less where we are, then the percentile moves. But this is a good point to discuss maybe later on. But I would claim so, needs to clearly reshape its lifestyles, but not to revolutionize it. Top 10 and top 1 is clearly a complete revolution. So like, they completely have to change what they do. And this is only the point of view of consumption. There is a point of view of production, which are, NGOs and other movements are trying to elaborate. I don't have time to go on about that, but we wanted this data to be in the introduction because we thought that was the original stuff coming up on the presentation of 2019, and we wanted that to be.
Thanks a lot, Emanuele. So I will be focusing now on, we will be focusing now on two of the chapters. So we have talked about the introductory chapter of the handbook, and now we're going to look at two chapters, one on environmental movements and the other one on post-work by Luigi. So what does a critical approach to environmental movements entails? I think first of all, it entails recognizing that mainstream debates have been steered through a Western, let's say, gaze. So they've privileged a particular type of environmentalism, and a type of environmentalism that was not much concerned about livelihoods, about bodies or issues of social justice. That means that there has been an invisibilization of non-Western, for example, environmentalism, and also a parallel consideration of Western environmental movements that were giving a center stage to the entanglements of social and environmental concerns as not reaching the high ranks of pure environmentalism, no? So they were depicted as brown concerns, for example, and I take, in this chapter, I've been taking a different perspective. So I've been focusing exactly on the debates around this issue and how the struggles for environmental sustainability have overlapped with the struggles for social justice as well, with social concerns, I would say. More particularly in Western countries, but with an eye also to, let's say, to the Global South, which is a topic, the object of a specific chapter. That's why I've been focusing more specifically on Western countries. So I've used the term social environmental movements to depict exactly those movements where the expression of ecological concerns has gone hand in hand with broader socio-political claims, following a conceptualization of a strand of study within social movement studies that has placed the democratic quest at the core of the understanding of environmental movements. And I've looked at these three dimensions of analysis: a type of environmentalism or varieties of environmentalism, organizational forms, and repertoires of action. Next slide, sorry, Luigi. Thanks. Looking at varieties of environmentalism, so I've said, for example, looking at this concept that I used, social environmental movements, has been used in different ways by different authors that have, for example, Doherty has used the term green movement to specify a subset of the broader environmental movement whose collective identity includes a commitment to non-hierarchical styles of organization and acceptance of the values of changing one's lifestyle to be consistent with the political principles. So this means overriding, so excluding for Doherty all those environmental movement organizations that do not challenge the existing political system or social system. And he situates the reason why the environmental movement actually took this direction, majoritarian direction, let's say, in the 70s and 60s, is because of the influence of the New Left. But he actually is drawing his category on another distinction by Andrew Dobson on his book Green Political Thought, if I remember well, was called, from the 1990s. So he distinguished between ecologism and environmentalism. So while environmentalism, according to Dobson, argues for a managerial approach to environmental problems without questioning, so without fundamental changes in present values or patterns of production, ecologism holds that a sustainable and fulfilling existence presupposes radical changes in the way we interrelate, in the relationship to the non-human world, and also in our mode of social and political life. And actually, this distinction by Dobson itself seems to be based, although Dobson does not really cite him directly, but largely seems to me paralleling the one by Gorz, Andre Gorz. He also distinguished between ecologism and environmentalism. So for Gorz, while environmentalism imposes only new constraints to capitalist economic rationality without questioning the bottom tendency of the system, ecologism implies a change of paradigm, so questioning the reasoning of techniques, production and consumption, and is aimed at reducing economic rationality and market exchanges. And then there is another distinction by Diani between conservationist political ecology groups and new environmentalists. No, in his book Green Networks, or in the Italian version, Isole nell'Arcipelago. So the idea that political ecologists, and this would actually resound with the ecologist variant by Dobson and Doherty, and with the green movement by Doherty and the distinction by Dobson and Gortz. So political ecologists blame the capitalist mode of production for the exploitation of both nature and labor power, and they were found in forms of class struggle outside and within the factory. And then another, I cannot, of course, mention the Martinez-Allier distinction, the three varieties of environmentalism, the gospel of, well, first of all, the cult of wilderness, which resounds very much with the conservationist by Diani, but he more particularly emphasizes how the love for pristine nature of the conservationists or cult of wilderness was actually non-considering the lay local knowledge and the rights of the people, the local people living in those environments. The gospel of eco-efficiencies resounds very much with the pragmatist, for example, by Diani, so concerned with the efficient use of resources by means, for example, of economic valuation. And, but more importantly, Martinez-Allier was criticizing the post-materialistic thesis that Luigi just mentioned. So the idea that actually the environmental movement in the so-called second wave of environmentalism emerged because of affluence in Western countries. So people were rich enough to dedicate themselves also to these self-expression values such as democracy and environmental values, but just because they had satisfied the subsistence needs, the basic needs. So the transition from scarcity to relative affluence was at the base, according to Ronald Inglehart, to the so-called, was at the base of the environmental movements, so at the base of his post-materialistic thesis. And this was criticized by Martinez-Allier. I cannot enter into the whole debate, but according to Martinez-Allier, this was misrepresenting the source of environmental problems, even in Western countries, because the environmental values were to be found not in affluence-induced liberation from basic needs, survival needs, but in the environmental consequences produced by affluence, such as environmental pollution, depletion of natural resources, and so on. And it was forgetting, actually, the so-called environmentalism of the poor, which is the concept that Martinez-Allier is famous for, one of the. So environmentalism of the poor was actually a concept that was in conflict with the mainstream narrative of those years. So the idea that environmental, which is still dominant today, the idea that environmental movements are a middle-class phenomenon that actually emerged in Western countries, and that it's interesting because in those years, for example, there was the environmental justice movement in the United States at the end of the 70s, which was actually contradicting already that hypothesis. And then if we think also in many countries, there was a so-called working class environmentalism or labor environmentalism. So the fact that basically there was, in some countries such as Italy, actually environmental issues were emerging also within the factory through an alliance forged by that was putting together environmentalists with militant scientists and workers. So for the safety of the working environment. This section, well, anyway, it depends all this part on variety of environmentalism, and then the other section is on organizational forms. So I look more particularly at the way the second wave of environmentalism, let's say, brought to an institutionalization of the movement, which was both external, so NGOs as a source of expertise for government and involved in policy networks, for example, with businesses and governments and so on, but also internal, that means professionalization, formalization of environmental movement organization. And then there is a whole debate, which I try to deepen a bit in the chapter, also about whether the formalization, professionalization, institutionalization of the movement leads to a loss of democratic potential or transformative potential of the movements. So there have been quite different views on this, starting from Piven and Clowar's seminal work from '79, So they were looking at, they argued that formal organization was actually undermining the disruptive capacity of movements, but then resource mobilization, actually scholars argued that the formal organization, the professionalization was helping, was making mobilization more effective. And for political opportunity scholars, movement institutionalization is even a sign of the strength of the movement. But anyway, with the third wave of environmentalism, these institutionalization trends got strengthened, and the environmental movement organizations were blamed to have turned into protest businesses, dominated by professional staff. There was not much democratic voice on the part of the members, and the idea, so that they turned into central corporate entities competing for recruiting members and funds from foundations, and also some argued that this led to co-optation of the movement. So not only, let's say, a moderation of the goals, but co-optation, for example, especially starting from what Emanuele was mentioning before, so Agenda 21, forged in the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, and the increasing reliance, increasing shift from public regulation to governance, to also neoliberal environmental governance, where environmental movement organizations had also a role in the so-called practices of responsibilization, the focus on political, for example, political consumerism, on consumption, and also, let's say, the politicization of environmental issues also. So anyway, it's not this link between institutionalization and, let's say, co-optation or moderation of goals. Of course, it's not a homogeneous phenomenon, and it's good to, for example, some authors have distinguished between professional versus participatory organizational models, and on the other hand, the disruptive versus conventional. And others I have actually said that the main distinction within environmental movement is actually between protest and actually service provision, also at the local level. For example, also some scholars here at Scuola Normale, such as Donatella della Porta, and Marodiani. And I think I have to cut a bit, so next slide. And then there is also a focus on repertoires of action. So I just want to say that we have seen in recent years an increase probably of environmental collective action at the local level. And this has been related, some scholars have related this, for example, the Barcelona School of Political Ecology, to the increase of social metabolism that is perceived, and the expansion of the commodity frontier, that is perceived as an important cause of the increase of the local and global environmental conflicts. I'm thinking here, for example, of the Environmental Justice Atlas by Martinez Ali and his team. But also authors have stressed how this increase of local collective action, of local mobilization, is also linked to, let's say, a loss of confidence in, let's say, in the role of also of political institutions, to solve the environmental issues, the socio-ecological crisis, and so on. Anyway, the grassroots environmental activism is considered to be a source of revitalization for the environmental movement, and has been the influence of the global justice movement in this regard has also been quite important. If we think about also for example, the climate justice movement, and also the new movements with the 2019 new climate, the new cycle of protest, there is also a reemergence of the justice issues that is probably coming from the global justice movement. So I will not go, don't have the time, of course, to talk about the latest cycle of struggle. There is a section on this and also on the environmental justice movement in the chapter. I just wanted to say that in line with what Emanuele said previously, there has been also a rising distrust. what we have seen in the latest algo is that there is, on the one hand, a coming back of state addressing forms of political action, political claims, but on the other hand, also low confidence in the government's ability to solve the climate issue, and also rising distrust in the UNFCCC process, which has probably started with Copenhagen, the COP15, but has heightened recently, in recent years. And then this is also linked to the last thing that I wanted to say, the Luigi has already mentioned this. So the repertoires of action focus on interstitial alternatives, and also so-called alternatives. So let's think, for example, about the blossoming of studies that have forged many different, a panoply of concepts, such as, for example, here at Scuola Normale, direct social action, for example, by Bossi and Zamponi, or Zamponi and Bossi, sustainable community movement by Francesca Forno and Graziano, alternative action organization, Giunghi and Grasso, alternative forms of resilience, and so on and so forth. So all these concepts have tried to tackle something that in social movement studies was somewhat marginalized, because social movement studies were focusing mostly on adversarial types of action. No? So the way the enactment of alternative forms of need satisfaction in different spheres and also the enactment of different ways of being and acting was also, so a sort of ecological prefiguration was also visibilizing on the other hand an ontological, a potential ontological alternative. No? Some people have talked about alternative values and others, for example, about radical imaginaries. No? But the idea is to create a new, a potential ontological alternative, basically, to the dominant values. And I will stop here.
Yes, thank you. I think I'll skip my short talk about the chapter on post-work and ecology. I just say, just to give a further flavor of the critical posture or standpoint that the book takes, this idea is that all the debates about post-work, at least this is the case I try to make in the chapter, underestimate or underaddress the issue of the relationship with nature or the biophysical environment and nature and the resources. So it is mostly focused on the social side of the issue, so how it is possible to go over traditional work, traditional occupation, jobs, and how it is possible to develop a society based on, for example, to universal income, whatever. But the physical part of the issue is greatly under-addressed. One problem is that there is an under-exploration, and at least this is the case I try to make, of the very notion of work as a way to relate to nature and to the physical environment, or the physical dimension. So probably also considering the situation in which capital, as we were discussing last week in the seminar of POE, capital is modifying its way to take nature, to take the biophysical world by increasing the real subsumption, or whatever one can call it, of nature, then this is the moment in which we probably should rethink and reconsider the very notion of work. So possibly post-work should be taken in a more radical sense, not going to a different type of different way of working or organizing work relations, but a different understanding what is work, what is our relationship with the biophysical environment. So basically the chapter says this, but I stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for this very detailed, of course. Absolutely detailed and rich excursus. So thank you a lot. It was very inspiring. And I will leave immediately the floor to the three discussants. Do you prefer to stay there, right? Or we start with Gemma? How did you organize internally? Okay, so Gemma, do you want to start?
Yes, I can start.
Okay.
Yeah, I will keep it very brief since I don't have much time. No, but thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting, very timely handbook, and I also really enjoyed reading the text, the introduction to the handbook. And yeah, I have two questions about that. So the first one is so what I really appreciated was, the positioning of the handbook and the field more in general into current political debates. So starting with Greta's speech was really effective, I thought. And the idea, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
Yes,
very
yes.
well.
Okay. I think it's very effective in this sense. And then I started wondering, okay, what does the field bring back to the movement, right? And of course, I think legitimation is very clear to me, giving substance to the claims. And of course, I'm not meaning it in a very dualistic and separated way. I think, of course, activists are knowledge producers, and researchers can be activists, as most of us are. So, of course, I'm not saying these are two separated things, but still, I think I guess I'm asking if you could articulate this relationship between the social movement and the academic field, that is critical environmental politics. And the second question is something that I thought it was in the, like I read between the lines, but it was not really spelled out in the introduction. I thought it's the relationship between expropriation and exploitation. So I would like just to ask you if you think this is relevant to the field, like social reproduction theories, if they have a place in critical environmental politics or not, and if so, which place do you think it is? And yeah, so I will stop here. Sorry if I'm a little slow, but it's early morning here. I'm in the US, so if something was not clear, it's because of that. But yeah, thanks a lot, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Gemma. Irina?
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Gemma, for your comments. It's very nice to have you here this often, once per week. So I hope that will continue next year. No, I also think that the handbook is timely, and it definitely enriches our own library here. I just have two question and one comment. In general, there is something that was not completely clear to me, and that I would like to have further clarification from you. In the introduction, I really appreciated how you spend time working on concepts. I think that's one of the most important contribution that the handbook overall makes. So a very sensitive attention to the use of words, why you use specific words, where do they come from. And there is this passage where you discuss environmental, that was also mentioned before here in the presentation. But then I found its use of environmental as a relational concept not quite consistent throughout the chapters, also some of the others that are in the summary. So its relation with ecology, the difference between the two, how we different use those. For example, Viviana speaks of socio-environmental movements, but then we have eco-socialism. We have like still a plethora of concepts. So I was a bit confused by that specification in the beginning and multiple uses afterwards. Sticking to the point on concepts, and I think it's something we also discussed last week, so I guess it's quite important overall in the field of environmental studies and environmental movements. Maybe it's a question more directed to Viviana's chapter and social movements, but I think it also applies to the other two chapters. And that's a bit the presence of this tension that you also mentioned in the introduction again, when you discuss locality and what it means, what it brings to theories, to kind of depart a bit from grand theories, very general concepts that are kind of all-encompassing and can represent everything, and delve a bit deeper into the specificities of sites, milieus, actors, and so on. So I find this a very useful premise that I share in theory and everything, but then I think we somehow lack its analytical implementation. So in the end, we go back to theorizing concepts that are kind of at meso, if not macro level, and again, try to be broad and encompass a large arena of empirical instances, and we miss we lack again a bit of the local and grassroots specificity. And I think this specifically from a social movements literature, where I found that concepts, I think I read this in what Viviana was saying in the conclusion of her presentation about how we had these new definitions of movements. But then still, I feel like that is a literature of social movements that is quite slow compared to the innovations that happen in the field. And sometimes I feel like in the end, we kind of circle back to theorizing in dualism, theorizing in binary schemes, and not really grasping analytical nuance. And just a very last question, Lele touched upon it in his speech, was what do you think of the handbook of your chapters and theoretical work in regard to what is happening now with the COP28? So a bit of a kind of actualization of what we've seen in these days. But thank you very much.
Thank you. I also want to thank the authors and the editors of this text. I really enjoyed the introduction. I'm looking forward to getting a chance to read some of the chapters. But I thought that I was a discussant before having had a chance to read it. So I came to it thinking, okay, well, I need to make some notes about what to discuss. And then it all just ended up being highlights of all the things that I wanted to remember and use, all this stuff. So I really did enjoy it. And so my comments, I wanted to take some quotes from that intro chapter to kind of situate some of my questions, and also kind of contextualize my questions in the sense of them being also a bit broader than just your responses and your maybe specific contributions to the book, but also other contributions to the book, and also maybe in general how we as academics, as the wider academic community, are approaching some of these questions. So first quotation, kind of stemming from obviously the structure of the chapter in some ways, is being critical entails both doing good research, so increasing of knowledge, and making that research instrumental to tackling domination. So what do you believe are some of the things that have come out, or the ways in which the handbook was shaped to try and do that? And again, I guess that's for us to also kind of reflect on our own work and how that might prove to be or attempt to be instrumental in tackling domination. Another quote, apologies. Crisis meant a decisive moment of confirmation or upheaval of the political order. Yet, it now increasingly expresses a permanent situation from which there is no exit. And so I was wondering what we gain from the use and what we potentially risk with the use of crisis in our discourse as academics, how we kind of conceptualize it within that kind of description, and how maybe the authors and yourselves obviously have used it within the context of the book. And then piggybacking off of the comment about how I thought it was very effective that the Greta quotation was used in the beginning to kind of contextualize not just the introductory chapter, but the kind of approach as a whole to the handbook. And I wanted to quote from her again, which obviously is something that you do there. There is no planet B. So this is from her kind of famous speech now, right? There is no planet B. There is no planet blah, 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 blah. This is not about some expensive, politically correct green-ass bunny hugging or blah, blah, blah. Green economy, blah, 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 net zero by 2050, blah, 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 net zero, blah, 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 right? And later in the chapter, you go on to discuss how she ignores the framework as you discussed today, and basically calls on the media to kind of present the crisis as a crisis. And I kind of wanted to think about this as also a kind of call to us as academics, and obviously talking about a critical environmental politics, thinking about critical theory, bringing in the Frankfurt School, and thinking about perhaps the idea of the kind of industrialization of academic work, right? If we think of cultural industries, and whether or not we should be thinking about, I suppose, not just the content of the work that we're producing and the ways that that might, again, going back to the idea of tackling domination, but the form in which that takes, and whether the kind of call that Greta is asking us to make also applies, or asking the media to make, also applies to us in how we maybe reshape or rethink the way that we formulate our own academic work, and whether or not the form that it takes and the kind of repetition in its form that we continue to produce, regardless of the content, actually reproduces the same problems.
Okay, thank you, Eugene. And if you want to start answering these very important questions. And then if there is time, we can also make a second round of, but I don't think so. Okay, Viviana, do you want to start?
Okay.
Oh,
You go. Yeah.
I mean, it's a difficult task, so they give it to me. No, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I mean, yeah, well, I mean, I am the one sacrificable. I'm joking. No, the point which has been raised basically by the three discussants is the relationship with social movements and, like, the posture. How do we address that? And I mean, it is a very complicated one. I mean, personally, I still struggle doing that, and we have discussed that both with regard to who to invite, because I mean, not all contributors share our posture in the introduction. So, like, we wanted, because I mean, the tension, at least for me, and the way we discussed at the very beginning, is that with an handbook, you first of all want to produce a map. And the map doesn't need necessarily to be metacritical. Like, you can have a map of critical approaches, which is not critical in itself. And that would have been okay. I mean, like, that was an option. We decided to insert a little bit of that meta, but not to the point not to have a map. So basically what you want to do is to manage attention, okay? Then, of course, not all the people we originally invited said yes. So then you adjust in itinerary. Some people even said yes, and then they had some issues and they couldn't deliver. So we had to go back, and, like, it was, but the idea was to try to show openly that that tension was at play in our work. Because I mean, in a sense, I am a sociologist. I also have the easy way out, which is Weberian. I mean, it is easy because it is very good. Like, easy things are okay. And this is like, well, you have objectivity in the method, and then, of course, if you are an activist, say that, it's legitimate. If you do good science by, respecting the method, or even innovating it, but in a way which is consistent with the spirit of sociology, then go ahead. And be open in saying that. Is, as I said, okay, and at the same time somehow problematic, because it's not that true that the way we sit in the conjuncture explains why we are in. I mean, methodologically we use some things and not others. So, in a sense, to make it very short, we wanted the problem to be there, for the reader to know we had been struggling with that, because we thought it was important to stay with the trouble, if you want, instead of providing easy way out. But we don't have an answer. Like, somehow, even myself in my personal, like my work, and with other groups, the issue of activist scholarship is always there. I change throughout time. I suspect I will change soon enough. So, it's something we wanted to pose, but we are not necessarily satisfied. When it comes to Greta, and I think Also, like question chapter on the introduction, how do they play out in right now, and also what I'm gonna say intersects Gemma's concern about the field of critical politics and the movement. So one thing I was struck, and so at least personally I tried to say let's look at that, and they were okay with that. So we did it by two things. The first is that when it comes to studies, even sociological studies, not just political science, on the UN COP system, like the whole UNFCCC process, you have a lot of descriptions, and very little reconstructive work. Like, up to a certain point, these principles were more important, and then something changed, and maybe like trying to say, okay, why did they change? Something like that. It's virtually absent. Which, in a way, if you look at how Latour discussing the Gilets jaunes, but also the environmental movements, always say, "Oh, don't give me analysis, give me descriptions." And I was like, "Wow, but you only had that." If you look at how at least mainstream scholarship look at that. And so, on the one hand, we wanted to at least pose the problem of saying, like, maybe in a handbook you need a little bit of a reconstruction of the conjuncture, but also, and that was the second thing that struck me, there has been a huge amount of analysis about not only Greta, also Vanessa Nakate, Angela Valenzuela, Luisa Neubauer in Germany, in general, all these female leaders of the climate justice movement, in which they are thoroughly analyzed and very little quoted, notwithstanding the fact that these female leaders speak very little. So it would be like, our long quote, that one is basically half of the speech. So, I mean, like, it's easy. And so we wanted this reconstruction to be somehow connected to words which weren't ours, but which were those who allow us to see things in a certain way.
Can you hear me now? Yes. So, related to this, so there was an overlapping, let's say, comment, about the relationship between the academia and social movements, and yes, I think it can be tackled in quite different ways, and there is not, I would say that there is not one single recipe that is the best. So I have struggled myself, for example, to in some of my research, I've preferred to not to be involved, for example, in action research, but rather take a more kind of participant observation standpoint, because I thought, but this does not, but I think that also the action research is a very valuable method in other contexts, but in that specific context, I found that specific, let's say, position as more, let's say, benefiting for me, for the movement, in order for the understanding of the movement, not simply for me, sorry. But I think also I'm very actually intrigued by action research, which now Emanuele is more, has been following more this method. I think there are trade-offs in both of these methods, and even when you do participant observation, which is like taking part to the movement, but not as a social movement activist, still I think there is much margin of maneuvering for being politically active. I still think so. Being let's say, when we think about their relationship between social movement and academic field, I think there is a value in both of these positions. And even if we take, I would say, more kind of standard, I would say, participant observation method, there is still way to actually enter and take a position in a way, Regarding the other topic, industrialization of academic work, that's, I would say, a real problem. So we are making more and more work that is not relevant for the wider public debate. So things that we are just going to read ourselves. So that's why it is important also like to be active also in other ways, you know? So that what we do research on and what we write on is also accessible to the wider audience, no? And now I think everything is even not like, it's even like, how do you say, it's not a commons anyway, no? So it's there is an enclosure also of academic research. If we think about enclosures in the sense that, no, let's think about all the role of journals and the big publishers and so on and so forth. Then there was another, the question by Irina on the role of grand theory, no? And you said that literature is very slow as compared to what happens in the field and not grasping analytical depth. I think that's in a way when, let's say for a handbook, the SODI was a handbook chapter. So of course I have to, I mean, I felt the responsibility to provide, of course, let's say, a quite wide overview, no, of the field, of course selecting the debates because it's impossible to focus on everything, the debates that I found most interesting also for the argument I wanted to make about critical environmental politics. Then I think case studies are a way to, of course, in a handbook you cannot just simply focus on one particular approach, but on the way different concepts can be used. But regarding your concern, the literature is quite slow. I would say yes. Partly this is also linked to the times of academic publishing. Some of my articles have, for example, been published years later, the moment I was writing them, no? And then let's consider also all the peer review process, which takes ages, no, in some journals. So that's part of the problem, and but not all. That's not probably the only element. Yeah, one let's say an additional element that has some influence, I think, is also the way sometimes exactly because of this publish or perish, let's say, logics. It's easier to follow the, let's say, the trends, no, in specific disciplines, and maybe without, let's say, profound analysis of the empirical, no, the empirical object we want to investigate. Sometimes that's something I've noticed.
Okay, so time constraint prevents me from properly addressing this very tough question, to which for sure I have excellent replies, but I just say one thing. So doing good research and putting it at use against domination, so the distinction that is made in the introduction between a critical handbook versus a handbook of critical. I give you just two examples from what you have said in the commentaries. So one is the problem of the use of the notion of environment and others. So the goal, of course, getting full consistency in a kind of thing like this is impossible, apart if in the case you constrain people, but then you don't get very, very much. But at least I believe that the book sensitizes the reader to the problem related to the use of words and the different possibilities. So if it succeeds in sensitizing, I am already happy, because it's already something. And the other point can be about a crisis. Yes, the sensitization here can be regarding the situation in which you are, where crisis is still presented as a fact, but is so something that state of affairs that you have to address, but it looks more and more a governmental device. And just sensitizing to this governmental use of the notion of crisis, it's important to address domination, as domination comes also from taking for facts those things that are used as governmental devices. So if gets this, I am already happy for the work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luigi. And I don't know if there are other questions. Otherwise, we can conclude this session here. So thank you a lot for coming here in Florence, and we hope to see you again. Although, and also for some PhD students, this dialogue is very fruitful. So thank you again, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you for this opportunity.